Welcome to Summit 2020 by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Together we have the pleasure of joining Nick Stern for a conversation on climate change and economics and the recovery packages that have been put in place post-COVID-19. Nick, you've written a paper recently on that specific topic, so let's just dive into it and see what you think are the most promising signs of the green agenda and the climate agenda being included in those recovery packages.
Thank you, Josh, and it's a pleasure to be involved in Summit 2020. And that is the right place to start. Because if you think about the conversations we had and were having up to December, January, we were talking about the transformation, the transition, how to move from the economy that we are now in to one that is much cleaner, much more efficient, zero carbon, and so on. It was about a transformation. Now, of course, we have a recovery in front of that transformation. What we have to do is to make sure that we recover strongly, because the unemployment in the world is devastating in many parts of the world and troubling everywhere. We have to recover quickly and strongly, and at the same time, we have to lay the foundation for the transformation that we know has to take place. So in the paper that you mentioned, together with Cameron Hepburn, Joe Stiglitz and others, we looked at the ways in which we could recover whilst investing in a much more sustainable economy. And we find that if you look at things like restoring degraded land, planting trees, looking after our water much more effectively. If you look at the physical side in terms of retrofitting buildings, taking out broadband, making our cities much more friendly to pedestrians and cyclists and so on, all those things are things that can be done quickly. They are labor intensive, and they have strong economic multipliers, particularly that their import content is not so big. It's just the kind of thing that Keynes would have looked for, and he'd have been right in terms of a recovery. So there's a very close fit between what we have to do from the point of view of sustainability and what we need for a strong recovery to deal with the terrible unemployment that we see around the world. And that is a new observation. We have been talking about the great job opportunities in the new, more efficient, cleaner, different ways of doing things. And that's right. But what we're seeing now is that in terms of a recovery, a build out from unemployment, that the sustainable agenda is the one that's the most powerful. And that's what this paper argued. And it is remarkable how well that's recognized in the finance ministries and central bank governors, central banks of the world. And it's very important that we press on that agenda so that observation becomes a reality. And we really do have a green and sustainable recovery, which is the prelude, charts the way towards a new way of developing and growing.
So if there was a worry that the stimulus packages and all the recovery efforts would put climate considerations on a back burner, what you're saying effectively is that there is recognition that these solutions are conducive to both the recovery and the climate agenda at the same time. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, but we have to turn that into a reality, because the immediate packages to support the economy, the immediate boosts are right across the economy, and they're not particularly green. I mean, the furlough program, which makes a lot of sense in the UK to try to retain employment, is not particularly a green or a brown or any other color. It's just trying to sustain the economy as it is. So if you look at the existing immediate packages of support, they do not look particularly green. What we're arguing here is that the next round of packages, beyond the sort of immediate rescue, the recovery package as opposed to the rescue story, that can and should be very strongly green. So there's a distinction between the immediate rescue, which is right across the economy. It is what it is. It's what the economy is. And the recovery. And that recovery, which is now where we are, has to be strongly green. And it makes enormous sense simply from the point of view of the recovery of employment itself, but of course immense sense from the point of view of where we need to go.
I'd like to pick up on what you said about the financial sector as well, picking up on these ideas. And we've seen a lot of divestment in fossil fuels, CO2 intensive activities. We see a lot of companies as well not going forward with exploiting assets that they own, like oil fields, or oil fields being devalued. Is that a mega trend? Is that something that is here to stay in your view, or is it simply a blip that will be changing?
It's a mega trend, it's here to stay, but it's nowhere near fast enough. And the challenge is to accelerate it. I mean, if you look at, just take one indicator of this, if you look at the US stock market under Trump, it's gone up by about 50%, but the oil and gas sector has gone down by about 50%. It's a very big change. And of course, it started before that, but it's accelerating. The challenge is, of course, to decarbonize our economy much more quickly. So we see those mega trends, we see those changes in technology, but we also see around the world that emissions are still rising. So we can see now that the opportunities are there. The opportunities are enormously attractive. Around the world, renewables with storage, round the clock. Solar, for example, in India and elsewhere, is coming in much cheaper than power generation through fossil fuels. That's just one example. The electric vehicles, once they get up and running, are going to be cheaper than the internal combustion engine, which is a very inefficient phenomenon. So we can see now all these opportunities which are taking us away from the fossil fuels. Well, the frustrating thing, of course, is we're not moving anywhere near fast enough.
So that's looking at the energy side of the equation. We could also look at production and consumption and the role that strategies such as the circular economy can play in that decarbonization. Do you think that's being acknowledged enough?
It's being acknowledged, but it's not being acknowledged enough. The efficiency story right across the board, the efficiency with which we use our resources, we've known for a long time has to be at center stage on reducing emissions, and of course much beyond simply the climate, important, overwhelmingly important though that is, into the damage we do to the environment more generally. And wastefulness and inefficiency are a key part of the challenge of overcoming wastefulness and inefficiency, is a key part of the challenge of delinking our economic activities from the damage they do to the environment, breaking that chain of damage from economic activity to environment. And the circular economy, the much, much more efficient use of all our resources, including energy, but way beyond energy, is absolutely vital to that. And I think we're only beginning here. And that is something which the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as we both know, has placed at center stage. It's picking up, but it's got a long way to go. And I think people don't yet realize the immense nature of the possibilities in the circular economy, and that it's a much more attractive way to organize ourselves.
Which begs the question of how we got there. And you were talking about land degradation and ecosystem services, the lack of valuation of these. You've argued for a long time that the climate crisis was the biggest market failure, which talks about going to the fundamental and the cost structure and the incentives that lie behind the economy. So we know that's not going to be reversed overnight, but what immediate steps can be taken in order to take into account these externalities and start integrating them?
There's a whole collection of things that we can do. The simplest form from economics around emissions is a carbon tax or a carbon price. Normally, if you go out to eat, you expect to pay for the food, you expect to pay for the space, you expect to pay for the services associated with the preparation of the food and so on, because you're using up those resources. If you use them up, then other people can't use them. But what we have in the case of the carbon emissions is my action in, however I do it, burning fossil fuels, my actions in emitting carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, create costs on other people. So I am not taking account of the damage I do to other people or the deprivation I cause to other people unless there's either regulation or a carbon price, and economists tend to go for price mechanisms, and that is a very important part of the story. But it's not the only part, and I think economists make a mistake if they think it's only about a carbon price. But that principle of facing people with the costs of their actions is a good, strong principle, and I think it will be part of the story. And it's not just a carbon story. We make people pay for waste products because it costs to handle those waste products, and that is a key element in policy, getting people to pay for the damage that they do. But there's so much more than that. Regulation can be extremely important. If you think about the banning of the incandescent light bulb, it's hugely inefficient. You want light, and what you get is loads of heat along with the light with the incandescent light bulb. It's very, very wasteful. We recognized that, particularly in Europe, and said it had to be replaced. You couldn't use those bulbs. And very quickly, we had tremendous technical progress with the LED light bulbs coming through strongly and improving all the time and coming down in price. So that's an example. There are many more where regulation can work. City design is a very important part of the story. A lot of these externalities in cities come from the use of motor vehicles, partly the emissions of greenhouse gases, partly the congestion. So what you do is you redesign your city to make it much more friendly to pedestrians and cyclists. So those are examples: pricing and taxing, regulation, design of cities, all of which give you ways of taking into account the damage, the externalities, if you like, that are caused. And we have to be much more creative. But there's one thing which is even bigger in some ways, and that's the overall strategy. If you set out very clearly where you're going in the next 20 or 30 years, what has to happen, what really matters, the targets for emissions reductions, then you start to get change. And if you think of what we've seen in the last 10 years in rapidly falling cost of solar, rapidly falling cost of wind, rapidly falling cost of storage, new materials coming through, all the major car companies talking about the end of the era of the internal combustion engine, that didn't come from a carbon price. That came, although I'm sure the carbon price helps, and the stronger carbon price would help more, but it came from people's understanding of where the overall economy was going. It came from people's insistence that we must be much more sustainable in what we do. So we can talk about the particular policies, the taxes and the regulations and the city design and the circular economy design and so on. But just as important is that that is set in an overall understanding of where we need to go. And that itself has produced very big change. And given that the policy has been fairly weak, it seems to me that we can imagine just how fast we could go if we strengthened the policies that were supporting that overall sense of direction.
And do you see that happening in specific regions or countries or cities around the world? Do you have any examples?
It's moving at different rates in different places. In the UK, we will be not using coal in electricity at all very soon. Actually, in many ways, we've stopped already. Some countries, particularly the Scandinavian countries, are moving very quickly towards alternative vehicles in transport. Many countries around the world are moving very quickly on hydrogen. That's true, actually, it's moving very quickly in China and elsewhere. So different countries moving at different rates. But we do nevertheless see around the world emissions still rising. And of course, the most important country, just in terms of the numbers, is China. And emissions are flattening in China, but we cannot say yet that emissions have peaked in China. And the biggest event really in the story of climate change is going to be China's 14th five-year plan, which is 2021 to 2025. And of course, in relation to that, China's connections with the Belt and Road Initiative, its connections with other countries, particularly nearby, but some countries further afield, and the way it's being involved in the infrastructure in the Belt and Road Initiative countries. Numerically, that's absolutely the most important. And there's a big discussion going on right now in China as to the structure of that 14th five-year plan. China's coal had more or less plateaued over the last few years, really over the last 5 years or so. But the last couple of years, it started to tick up a little bit. So how China moves in the 14th five-year plan, 2021 to 2025, is absolutely crucial for the future of the world, particularly, of course, when you add to that its relationship with the Belt and Road Initiative countries. And that's why our relationship with China, our collaboration with China, is so important. And the most important vehicle for that, I think, will be between Europe and China, as both of them set their plans for this coming decade.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we know that in July 2018, China and the EU have signed a memorandum of understanding around circular economy, which remains embryonic, but it does signal a sense of direction. China was the first country to have circular economy at the heart of its policy in 2008. The question is, how can we foster that dialogue and relationship? Is it through trade? Is it through investment? Knowledge exchange? What's the most effective vehicle?
I would emphasize, thinking of Europe now, two things: example and collaboration around knowledge. The trade story would support that. But if Europe can continue to show just how fast it's possible to move in terms of decarbonizing the economy, whilst at the same time raising living standards, not narrow GDP here, but raising living standards across the board, then I think that example could be very powerful. The more we can show in Europe that it's not a narrow trade-off between the economy and environmental responsibility, that actually the best way to raise living standards is the drive to the much better environment and the low carbon economy. The more we can show that, the more I think the discussion in China and elsewhere can be helped in a positive direction on combining rising living standards with decreasing damage to the environment. So that example is extremely important. So too is the sharing of knowledge. And one example of that is the management of grid systems. And when you increase the renewables in a grid system, you have to manage fluctuation. You have to balance out supply and demand. You have to move electricity from one place to another. We've learned enormously how to manage grid systems. And China actually has shown us a lot about how to transport electricity much more cheaply than was possible before. But management of the grid system is enormously important. It's partly technical, but it's partly political. And in China, you've got a lot of the vested interests in coal essentially pushing the grid system so that coal-based electricity generation gets priority. And that is makes very little sense, because the cost of renewables now is so low. But that is, if you like, political vested interest. If you look at ourselves in Europe, then we have central Spain, where the cost of land is extremely low, where the sunshine is very strong, it could be an enormous source of solar power for the rest of Europe. But of course, that involves taking it north through France. And so the connectors have to be strong, and Electricité de France has to recognize the importance from the point of view of Europe as a whole of allowing the free flow of electricity and avoid taking a narrow view, protecting France's nuclear and so on. So we have big technical and political issues around the way we manage the grid. Now, there's much more than that, but I just wanted to give the example here of what technical collaboration could help produce. So I would emphasize those two things: the power of the example, showing what can be done, showing how European cities can be transformed to be much more attractive, where we can move and where we can breathe and where we can be much more efficient and productive. Those kinds of examples will be enormously important, but so also will be some technological exchange as well. It'll be two ways too, because I think China's moving very well on hydrogen, China's moving very well on the transport of electricity. Those exchanges of knowledge will be two ways, and we're going to learn from China about nuclear too. So these kinds of collaborations are enormously important. And if we just get into a confrontational relationship with China, a quarreling relationship, then it will make life much more difficult. That doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything with China. We clearly are not. But where we have the common objectives, example on climate, biodiversity, environment, where we have those common objectives, then I think the scope for collaboration is very strong. And I think also it would help on those areas where we will inevitably be differing, and so help the broader issues of relationships. But collaboration is absolutely crucial. And this is a moment where it's become a bit more tense and a bit more difficult. And I hope the environment, climate, biodiversity will be an area where we really can get together, Europe and China.
Yeah, biodiversity is a really important one on the calendar next year, with the COP15 biodiversity being hosted by China. There's a lot of talk about nature-based solutions. Sometimes it feels a bit abstract and not a lot of people get what these solutions are. Would it be a good moment to unpack them as well and see how the private sector, including SMEs, can play a role? It's not only about massive programs of planting trillions of trees, is it?
It isn't. It's really about the reforming of the whole of agriculture and food systems. I mean, broadly speaking, agricultural subsidies around the world are running at around $600 billion a year. I mean, it depends how you measure, but very, very large. And in many places, what do we get for that? We get degraded land, where people just soil mine and destroy the quality of the soil. In many places, we get poisoned rivers, and in many places, we get deforestation. And often it's the bigger companies, the bigger firms, the bigger farms, the richer people who get most of the benefit from those subsidies. So we have agricultural support and food systems around the world, which are very damaging. Now, I'm not arguing for reducing the support for agriculture and land and forests. We probably should increase it, but it should take a very different form. And that means thinking much more about encouraging the use of land in a much more natural way that doesn't encourage the mining of the soil, that doesn't encourage the poisoning of waterways. And that's something which we really can do and which we understand much better now. The language that's increasingly being used in the UK, and I think it's useful, and beyond, is public money for public goods. So if we support agricultural activities, as I think we should, we do it in a way that means they're much less damaging to the environment, and actually do it in a way which can produce really strong environmental benefits in terms of biodiversity, in terms of water management, in terms of quality of food and so on. So this is something which is going to be a big public policy issue right across the board. And we have to see it in terms of using our resources better. We have to see it in terms of investment and encouraging the right investment. So I don't think that this will actually cost the public purse, but what it will involve is a very different way of doing things and a very different set of policies. And that is really urgent. It's something which, with the conference on biodiversity in China next year, in the middle of next year, COP15 of the Convention on Biodiversity, and COP26, the 26th Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, taking place in Glasgow in November next year, 2021 is a real opportunity to go forward. And I hope that we work together as a world to make that happen. And I would note in that context that next year, the presidency of the G7 is with the UK, and the presidency of the G20 is with Italy. And it's those two countries which are in the presidency of COP26. So it's actually quite a good combination of circumstances where you see that leadership with UK and Italy, G7, G20, COP26 coming together. You see the great willingness of China to collaborate around biodiversity. I think 2021 should be a real opportunity, and it will be also the year when I hope the green recovery really starts to get underway. So the decisions that will be taken in 2021 will be shaped right now, and that's why these kinds of discussions are so important.
Thank you very much for that optimistic note, Nick. Just to conclude, if you could...
be very careful, Joss. I'm optimistic about what we can do. There are huge opportunities in doing things differently. There are these political opportunities as well. I'm hugely optimistic about what we can do. I worry deeply about whether we will.
Absolutely. And I think that sentiment is shared by a lot of actors in that field, but being clear on what can be done is the first step to action, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we have to really see that we can build a much, much better, more attractive world where we absolutely break the relationship between economic activity and damage to the environment, with cities where we can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, living standards, diets improving across the world. There's a real opportunity to do things differently. But that doesn't mean it's easy. We have to take decisions, we have to make investments, we have to manage transformations, and all that has to be done. But you have to have the vision of what's possible. And that vision of what's possible is becoming reality in many places.
Nick Stern, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for all your hard work.
It's a real pleasure, Josh, and thank you for the Summit 2020, and thank you for all the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is doing.